Ed Mitzel currently works as a science specialist in Baltimore City Public Schools. Prior to this role, he worked as a consultant in school leadership and school improvement following more than 30 years in public education. He retired from the Maryland State Department of Education, otherwise known as our favorite MSDE, where he was executive director in the Office of Leadership Development and School Improvement. Before MSDE, Ed served as a biology teacher in the Cecil County Public Schools and for 16 years as principal in Baltimore County. Mr. Mitzel has held the role of principal, assistant principal, science department chair, magnet coordinator, and science teacher for schools in middle and high school suburban settings. He earned his BS from the University of Delaware, MAT from Johns Hopkins University, and is currently pursuing his PhD at Notre Dame of Maryland University. His external reader on his dissertation work is Dr. Brian Collier, and Dr. Collier is professor of surgery and director of trauma services at Carilion Clinic in Roanoke, Virginia. So I'm delighted to welcome Ed here today as he shares his research with you all.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Doherty and members of the committee. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join me this afternoon for my dissertation defense. I wanted to first recognize the members of my family, friends, colleagues that are here this afternoon. So first, a shout out to my 3 children, Matthew and his girlfriend there. It looks like they're limited Wi-Fi, they're international, and Pearlie, my daughter Caroline, and my daughter Stephanie. And I greatly appreciate their support and encouragement through the years. It's kind of been a running joke that who would graduate when, and maybe I'd finish by high school or their college, and now they're all done high school, done college, and on to grad school, and I'm still trying to finish up. Also, Amber and Mary Ellen, Dr. Morrissey, recently a new doctor, are 2 colleagues from Notre Dame that are joining, and also 2 work colleagues, Lauren Browning and Angie Hood. And Lauren is a current PhD student at George Washington. So I guess she's going to get some insight from this afternoon's proceedings. So I think I'll go to the share screen and then get started if that works for you or for everyone. Everybody can see that, correct? All right, so for the committee, I have listed there Dr. Doherty, Dr. Snyder. I greatly appreciate your patience, feedback, support, encouragement through this rather long journey. My dissertation is how are Maryland athletes managed for the successful return to the classroom following a sport-related concussion, quantitative review from the Maryland School Administrative's perspective. So I think what's important in the topic is just to kind of give you a little bit of background and some information and maybe some terms. So I'm going to show this, hopefully this 30-second video that gives an overview from the National Health Agency. And hopefully I'll be able to see if I can share sound first so that we know that that's working.
A concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury, or TBI, caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes your head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. This sudden movement can literally cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, stretching and damaging the brain cells and creating chemical changes in the brain. What you might not know is that these chemical changes make the brain more sensitive to any increased stress or injury until it fully recovers.
So although short, it talks about the injury, and you can see in this graphic down on the bottom that it's the twisting, shaking, or movement, and the skull is what protects the brain. And once you have that interaction, which could be bring to surface or bring to another adult or human or player or to a ball or an object, you have this chemical changings that then does cause various symptoms, including physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms, which of course exacerbate attending school.
A concussion is a
So the background and purpose, this has clearly become a health threat when you look at the numbers of students that do suffer from a concussion. Sarmiento and the CDC have identified it in 2018 as a significant health risk for students. When I started my journey many years ago, I was really zooming in on the legislation for return to play, which was designed to protect student athletes from going back onto the field after suffering a concussion. In 2009, the state of Washington was the first state to pass legislation. In 2011, Maryland followed suit. And then, of course, as I took a little bit of a break, most of the states have legislation now. All of the states have legislation. So then I shifted my focus to return to play in terms of how do we manage the athlete once they have suffered from a concussion, because the brain does need that healing and that support. So you can see that in the lower portion of the slide talks about the guidance through Maryland State Department of Education. They developed the policy, and then MPSSAA, which is the Maryland Public Schools Athletic Association, and they drafted guidelines initially in 2012 and then updated in 2023. But the issue or concern that I identified was that there was no specific protocol or guideline or plan in place for return to learn. And I believe Dr. Collier is now joining us via phone. So we'll just make a shout out. He is my other reader. Thank you, Dr. Collier, for making time this afternoon. So initially, RTP was the return to play, and that has to do with practicing and not going back out on the field or the court, and then return to learn. And my focus for this study has been on the return to learn plan. So from the study and the research, I created a conceptual framework, and it's been supported by the references that are listed there toward the bottom. And when you really initially, it is about the well-being and safety of students, which is really at the center of this slide. And then I drew it as various circles to kind of think about the spheres of influence. So you have the upper left where you're looking at the Public School Athletic Association, Maryland law and policy. Then in the middle or over to the side around 1 or 2 o'clock, you have teachers and parents, and then the medical professionals guided by American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Neurology, Center for Disease Control. Where my study really zooms in is just this smaller segment between the medical professionals, the student athletes, parents, and then the school leaders. And my question was, what really is being done to support students as they return back to the classroom? As I updated my research with the gaps in the literature, in the more recent studies, the return to play identified the concept that few states have legislation for return to play. In the second study, there's no specific protocol, even in Maryland, as they're identified as a state that has some consistency or some semblance of return to learn. It is not clear exactly what it is that school systems should be doing to manage the students as they return. In an Ohio principal study, which was a cross-sectional study, they identified the need for training, case management, and a point of contact. In the Indiana study, they talked about academic accommodations, what could be provided, again, the idea of training, and then identifying what barriers there might be for implementation. In the Nebraska study, followed up similarly with protocols, what may or may not be in place, a focus on return to learn and how it's implemented. And then the survey for athletic trainers, again, looking at administrators and athletic trainers having the knowledge of those protocols or guidelines and what resources that they could provide, again, to ensure that cognitive rest that's necessary for the brain to recover from a mild traumatic brain injury. Again, my niche became the appropriate academic accommodations that are described by the Maryland regulation, and that's all they really say is appropriate accommodations. And they push that out to the local systems. And so then my questions became, what does that really look like? So my three research questions, my first one was really delving into what is the training for school personnel, namely school administrators, and what are they doing in terms of at their schoolhouse, and then looking at that according to, is there any variation with school size and school type? Then secondary, my question was, how are school leaders supporting the athletes, really using those guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the 6th International Conference on Concussion in Sport to identify specifically how are students supported? Are these accommodations or adjustments aligned to those two standards? And then lastly, from the studies, formulating the question of what barriers and challenges might exist to actual implementation and supporting our students. So in my methodology and some of the descriptive statistics of my survey sample, it was a quantitative research design, exploratory, and a cross-sectional survey. I used the studies that I just previously briefly mentioned to formulate my 30-item survey. I conducted an expert review panel with 3 of the members that are on the team here, and also an athletics expert to really look at the content and clarity and structure of my questions, and then revisions as necessary before pushing it out. It went out electronically to over 400 administrators across the state of Maryland. I had a response rate of 28.9% and roughly a balance of 56% assistant principals and 44% principals responded to the survey. Some of the factors that I then broke down the information were related to school administrators and their years of experience, which I'll talk about briefly. Also, the school size and school type, and then the presence or absence of a plan. Namely, in a flow chart of the survey, if you answered that there was a plan, then you had additional questions so that I could get some further information about what exactly you were or were not doing with students. It was largely 97% public schools. A few were in the private or faith-based category. For years of experience, I originally asked in bands from 0 to 2, 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, and then more than 15. But for analysis, which I used SPSS, there were many categories that did not have a large enough cell size. So then I broke it into novice, 0 to 5 years, and experienced 6 or more. Similarly, for school size, I did the same banding. I looked at the Maryland Public School Athletic Association enrollment bands, where they classify 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A schools, a 1A being the smallest enrolled, 4A being the largest. Again, those bands, because of the sample response, needed to be combined. So I clustered them. 1A, 2A was the considered, quote, small. That had an N of 84. And then my large schools, 3A, 4A, had a N of 32. The 3A, 4A is about 1,400 plus students up to 2,500. And then the smaller schools can be in the 700 to 1,000 range, just to give you an idea. So I wanted to report the data and share with you my findings based on the 3 research questions, which you see here. So in the first one, really the largest information and fact that I discovered was with the training. So what training was available? Was it mandatory? And did you participate in it? And what I found was that school administrators where training was available and having a plan was statistically significant. School administrators participating in training and having a plan was statistically significant. Further breaking that down, as I mentioned earlier, I looked at the presence of a return to learn plan. You see the data there. N of 67, so about 57.8% of the schools had a plan. And then I looked at the categorical variables and I used SPSS to analyze by administrators' experience, as I explained to you, school size, the 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A designation, just clustering that into large and small, and then school type, middle school and high school. And then what I did find is that schools that, if they participated in training and had a plan, it was statistically significant for high school. If they participated in training and had a plan, it was also statistically significant for small schools. So that was research question 1. In research question 2, I examined what the student supports were. So in this table, it shows you their rank ordered for short-term accommodations, which are the top ones that are listed and described by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the 6th International Conference for Concussion in Sport. You can see with the checks indicating whether it was aligned to one or the other or both. And then what was important is that descriptively, 76% of the respondents indicated that they had some supports. Only 22% reported that they had a comprehensive plan. And then what I would focus on or draw your attention to is at the bottom that 40 administrators, 34.5%, indicated they did not know. Similarly, school day adjustments, and again, keep in mind that the accommodations and the adjustments are what the experts, American Academy of Pediatrics, suggest are necessary for students to cognitively recover after this mild traumatic brain injury. So again, in the same fashion, I'm reporting showing you the alignment to American Academy of Pediatrics and the 6th International Conference. I'm also showing you the short-term school day adjustments by rank and order. However, in this analysis, what was interesting is that it was statistically significant for experienced administrators to provide rest period in the nurse's office. And it was also statistically significant that high schools provided early dismissal. Again, I would also draw your attention to what's at the bottom, where there are 1.7% do not offer any accommodations and 29% do not know. So nearly a quarter, even closer to a third, really are not as aware. And I think that would come from the idea that as the school leader, understanding and knowing what's going on and providing those resources. My last research question dealt with barriers and challenges to implementation of concussion management. And the first table shows you the identified areas, and you note that communication was the largest challenge, almost 3 times as large compared to the next one, which was resources. And then the second table looked at the information and resources being shared on a school or district website for access and information. And you can see I presented the no category first because 65 respondents, which was 57% of the survey participants, indicated that it is not accessible or not provided to parents, families, and physicians. It was also noted statistically significant in high school that communication was a barrier. So just an overview of my summary, because I think it helps tell the story and then move toward what the implications might be. So in research question 1, training was noted that it was not mandatory. Training and a return to plan show that there was statistical significance if there was training and that there was presence of return to learn plan. 80% of the respondents indicated that there was not mandatory training in their current district. In research question 2, schools did identify the nurse. Only 50% of the schools identified the nurse as that point of contact or the person responsible for managing the plan. Then you see that the supports were aligned. However, the 35% of respondents that were not aware of what supports were offered or the 25% that were not aware of school day adjustments was important to note. And then lastly, in research question 3 related to communication, or barriers and challenges, excuse me, communication was the largest challenge, and 57% of the respondents indicated they do not share or have information available to parents or athletes or physicians on any kind of website or communication. So when I take my findings and I put them together and think about what does that really mean, and the no, so what, now what, I came up with 3 areas: policy, professional learning, and protocols. My hunch always was that there was this inconsistency. So my first recommendation would be to amend the current Maryland regulation and consider more details in the policy, specifically around return to learn, instead of just charging the local school districts with, in a way, that idea of making it happen. Professional learning, I think, largely addresses most of those concerns, because I think administrators, both new and experienced, and then a refresh, need to have that training. The key people, such as the nurse and athletic trainers and athletic directors, need to have training on that. What does a plan look like? What would be the specifics of who would be involved, and then actually how would that be managed? And then lastly, in terms of protocols, really tightening up what are the specific supports for students that need this cognitive rest since they have suffered a mild traumatic brain injury, and how is that communicated? And how do we really look to allow access for all student athletes, parents, families, and the physicians? And that connects to what would be topics for future research, possibly a mixed method study, looking in more detail with school administrators and really delving into specifics about what their plans involve and what they do or do not know about planning and implementing. Also, I'm looking at an examination of allocation of resources regionally across the state. Also urban, suburban, rural. I was not able to include that because there wasn't a clear definition, although I suspect that there might be interesting allocation of resources and equity issues across the state, as I even now continue to work with various schools across Maryland. Certainly a broader study going beyond Maryland would be something to consider as well. So I'll leave you with this last thought that I came up deep in my research from Hippocrates. No head injury is too severe to despair of, nor too trivial to ignore. It's about our children and how we support them. So I would like to say thank you, and I believe I'm going to open it up for questions at this time.